another slow Sunday morning in the Deep South, Ruston, Louisiana, where you can find 36 churches to keep you out of trouble. But one very memorable Sunday, those churches weren't enough to keep more trouble than this town had ever seen from showing up in the form of a loud, very profane stranger staying at a local motel.
Get out of town.
A stranger who, in a sense, ended up holding a whole town hostage. What would you do if it was your small town? The man behind that voice started a siege that would last more than 8 hours, promising for all that time how things would end badly. As the crisis unfolded, the local police would be faced with a series of harrowing decisions for which there was no roadmap. With virtually no expertise in dealing with hostage situations, officers would have to rely on some outside help and on their gut instincts, where any choice could mean life or death for a criminal, his hostages, and the police officers themselves. You aren't police officers, we figure most of you anyway, but over the next hour, we're going to put you in the command center, just as the officers in Ruston were. As we reconstruct the events of that day, you'll face the same decisions they did. You, like them, will be flying by the seat of your pants in a high-stakes game. Here's the challenge. Get the hostages out safely, if you can, any way you can.
We broke every rule there probably is in hostage negotiation.
Inspector Jay Kavanaugh was born, raised, and trained as a cop in this town, a career man at the Ruston Police Department.
I'd been on for 12 years, and we'd never had anything approaching this.
Never?
No.
Ruston is a slow-moving town of about 20,000, home of Louisiana Tech University. The big deal in Ruston is its peaches, said to be the juiciest this side of the Mississippi. Ruston is just a good place to raise a family, not a ruckus.
Petty burglaries.
Burglaries.
Traffic tickets.
Traffic tickets, maybe a couple of armed robberies a year. Just not a lot of real serious crime.
But on that Sunday back in 1987, Inspector Kavanaugh, who was 33, got the call that would put all his police training and his instincts to the test. A guest at the Economy Inn was holding hostages in his motel room at gunpoint.
In all honesty, we were not prepared.
Kavanaugh's buddy, J.C. Hilton, then a police lieutenant, was called in that day too.
We didn't have a SWAT team of any kind. We had not trained for anything like that. And we weren't ready for it.
It had all started around 10:25 that morning when Mary Grant and Addie Douglas, two motel housekeepers, went missing. They'd been pulled into a room by a stranger, the guest in room 44.
We knew he had a shotgun or a weapon.
And that put everybody in the area in danger.
Right.
When Inspector Kavanaugh arrived on the scene around 11:30, he learned the hostage taker had called the motel manager and identified himself as Dwight Reiser of Houston, Texas. Kavanaugh and two of his men moved into the tiny motel office that would become their makeshift command post for the duration of the ordeal. Kavanaugh sent a team of his men room to room through the motel, clearing out all the guests. Nearby buildings were evacuated too, and crowds were beginning to gather.
I mean, he pretty much shut down the whole town.
Kavanaugh took a deep breath and dialed up room 44. Cautiously, he began probing for information.
I wanted to know what his motivation was. You know, usually when people take a hostage, they want something. You know, they want $1 million. They want a helicopter. You know, they want tickets to the Super Bowl. They want something. He didn't want anything. He wanted to die.
Living in hell, real hell. And to live in a world without love is double hell.
Gulping down whiskey as he spoke, Reiser told Kavanaugh he had a sawed-off shotgun, and he said he wanted to be buried right there in Ruston. There wasn't much doubt he was suicidal, and Kavanaugh began to fear he was homicidal, too.
I'm gonna start shooting people.
Reiser said he had 5 hostages in the room with him, all women, 2 of them black, 3 white. He was threatening to kill them all.
Saw them white girls first.
And Reiser made it clear the hostages weren't his only targets.
I choose to make war on your police department here.
It made no sense, but the cops had a theory about what was motivating Dwight Reiser.
He was your suicide by cop. You know, he wanted to die, but he didn't want to do it, and he was going to make us do it.
And it seemed he wanted to go out in a blaze of gunfire, taking as many cops with him as he could. It was a more than plausible scenario. Cops had surrounded the motel. Officers from just about every law enforcement agency in the area. The police department, the highway patrol, even the Department of Fish and Wildlife. J.C. Hilton, armed with a .357 Magnum, was stationed in the parking lot.
You got to be thinking, sooner or later, we're going to go in there and get him.
I thought that was a good possibility that we would have to do that, or that someone was going to have to take him out that was on the outside.
It's the point battle-tested cops call going tactical, when talking stops and a coordinated attack begins. But remember, these cops are no experts. This is their first hostage situation ever.
Did you feel like you were equipped to do actual storming of a second store?
I was concerned there that if we actually had to go into the room, that was going to be a problem.
Because
we weren't trained for it.
So the cops in Ruston called some people who were. The FBI field office in New Orleans. They were patched through to Clint Van Zandt, then the FBI's chief hostage negotiator, based in Quantico, Virginia. Van Zandt's first advice, try to build a relationship with a hostage taker.
What you want to do is settle things down. You want to bring his emotional level down, and you want to get the hostage taker to identify with the voice of the negotiator.
So the Ruston police officer got back on the phone with his hostage taker.
Yeah, I was just checking, trying to make sure everything's okay, man. I hadn't heard from him. Yes, all right.
It was just the beginning of the longest day Ruston has ever seen. As the hours slowly passed, the hostage taker would grow more intoxicated, more violent, and less predictable. He would maintain the upper hand over the cops surrounding him, and he would make demands that were barely believable, but could not be ignored.
I had no idea, you know, that it was going to go, the incident would go the way it did.
In the morning, just about an hour after the crisis began, Dwight Reiser announced demand number one.
He wanted me to get a black preacher to come in and talk to him.
An armed, desperate man who has already claimed he wants to die. Now he wants a preacher. Was this demand an opening or a way to speed up meeting his maker?
That's very scary, because what it can suggest is basically, I want my last rites. I want to talk to someone, a person of the cloth, and once I have done that, once I've cleansed my soul, then I am ready, willing to die either at your hands or my hands.
The Ruston police had a choice to make now, and so do you. Should they meet Reiser's demand and find him a preacher to talk to? Should they just keep talking to him themselves, perhaps to stall for time? Or is this the signal to stop the talking and launch an armed assault on Room 44? Remember, you're the commander. It's your call.
So,
what did our somewhat jittery Ruston police officers do? They went to church, the Lane Chapel Baptist Church to be precise, about 2 miles from the motel standoff. There they found Assistant Deacon Robert Singleton. He'd preached to all kinds of crowds, but this was a calling he never anticipated. Back at the motel, Officer Kavanaugh gave Reiser the news. They'd met his first demand.
Okay, his name is Reverend Robert Singleton, and he wants to talk to you, okay? Wait a breath. He's black, okay? Yeah.
So at around 12:30, 2 hours after the crisis started, Reverend Robert Singleton walked into the cramped motel office that was serving as Central Command. And Kavanaugh handed him the phone.
Hello? Hello, sir. How you doing? How you doing, sir? I'm doing all right. What's your name? Dwight. Dwight?
When you walked into the command post, the police are talking about a pretty scary fellow.
mm-hmm.
And you pick up the phone, and what do you hear in the voice of the man that you spoke to?
A young man and need help.
I was just looking for a place to die, Reverend, that's all. Why do you want to do that?
More talk of suicide. Inside the command post, the listening officers held their breaths to see if Singleton, a person they'd never met before, could do what none of them had ever done. Talk down an armed, suicidal kidnapper.
Well, I don't have nobody to care for me for once.
Yes, look,
God loves you. Yeah, I love you.
What did you think you could do for Dwight Reiser as a preacher and as a black man?
Convince him to turn himself in.
Why did you think you could do that?
I have no idea, just a feeling.
Just a gut instinct, but the Reverend had some backup. Assistance from the Ruston cops who got advice from their friends at the FBI and passed the pastor notes as he spoke to Reiser. They told him not to make any promises and to try to keep the hostage taker engaged, even when he seemed to be drinking heavily and drifting away.
You depressed? Yes, very much. Well, talk to him about it. Tell me what it is. What you depressed about? Maybe we can... You can't ease it. Huh? The only thing easing this depression is death. You know, you're not thinking right at all. You're not making any sense, and you know that.
Meanwhile, word of the negotiations was filtering out to the team in the parking lot.
We're depending on the command center to tell us what's going on. Sometimes that information was slow getting to us.
J.C. Hilton and the other police officers in the parking lot kept getting glimpses of Reiser peering out the window with his sawed-off shotgun. About 20 men were posted on both sides of the parking lot, on the roof, in adjacent buildings, and across the street.
Basically, this was laid out like kind of a war zone here.
Pretty much.
And a war zone is exactly what Dwight Reiser was hoping to create. He'd said as much, claiming he was going to kill his hostages, starting with the white ones.
World War III all over again. No. Yes, sir.
Reiser told Reverend Singleton he was a Vietnam veteran, and he planned to use his combat experience against the Ruston police.
Marine Corps taught me good. I can slip out here and they'll never know. They'll be watching, they'll never know.
About 1 o'clock, 2.5 hours after he took his first hostage, Dwight Reiser started acting on his threats. He fired a shot.
When someone starts firing shots, the stakes in the situation go up drastically.
In a sense, it puts everything back to square one for the police, who can only wonder.
Has he killed a hostage? Is he shooting at law enforcement officers? Is he shooting at spirits that would suggest he's involved in some type of psychosis at the time?
With a little more probing, the officers decided Reiser hadn't hurt any of his hostages. His bullets had apparently ricocheted harmlessly around the room. But his threats were growing more ominous. Remember, he's told the police he has 3 white hostages and 2 black hostages. Now he told Reverend Singleton he intended to use a white hostage as a human shield.
I got one white girl nailed across the door. Why are you doing that? They ain't gonna hurt their own. Well, they'll kill us, you know it real.
Then, in the midst of all the chaos, Reiser made his second demand, one that will be the subject of your next decision.
Main thing I want to talk to you about is for you to comfort my people. That's it. That's all. I'm gone. I'm a loser.
Reiser asked Reverend Singleton to call his mother in Houston and a friend he called Mr. Skinner.
Now, will you promise me that you won't hurt nobody until I call Mr. Skinner and talk to him and call you back? I'll try.
Clearly, these were people who Reiser cared about. Could they be the key to ending the crisis? The police had already shut off the outgoing phone service from room 44, so if anyone was going to contact Reiser's best friend or his mom, it was going to have to be the Ruston police. Should they make those calls and patch them through so that the hostage taker could talk to his loved ones? Should they play for more time? Or is it time to storm the room and rescue the hostages? It's your decision.
When talking to his mother or any member of his family.
Why?
They tell him goodbye, and now they're afraid to die.
The next voice the hostage taker would hear was not his mother's, but that of Inspector Kavanaugh.
Hey, this is Kavanaugh.
And Reiser was now calling him by a special nickname.
Hey, General Custer, how you doing? General Custer. Last stand. No, man. How's everything going? Did you like the preacher that I got? Yeah, he was good. He was all right.
Reiser seemed to be calming down now, perhaps on the way to a breakthrough. To the FBI hostage negotiator, it was a validation that they'd done the right thing in holding back on an armed assault.
Each time something happens that in a normal law enforcement situation would have you rush in a hostage situation, you have to take that deep breath and say, okay, let's find out what we're actually dealing with and not respond to the emotion of the minute.
Inspector Kavanaugh sent 2 of his men into the room next door to where the ordeal was unfolding, trying to learn as much as he could about the number of hostages and their condition. But there was something they hadn't considered. Reiser could hear the officers through the motel wall.
Why are your officers next door?
Next door.
And through the window, he could see what looked like a SWAT team composed of local and state police.
I mean, it might have looked like a SWAT team to Dwight Reiser, but in your gut, you knew it was a lot of weekend hunters. And
I knew it was organized chaos.
And as if things weren't complicated enough, Reiser was now saying he had a weapon besides his gun in the room with him and the hostages. It was a Claymore landmine, he said, a weapon he'd learned to use in Vietnam.
If you got a mine, if you got a claymore, we don't, if it gets set off, we don't want anybody else getting hurt.
Again, Reiser seemed to soften a bit. He told Kavanaugh that a hostage, one of the motel housekeepers, was getting hysterical.
Why don't you let us have her checked? I don't want those girls hurt up there, those ladies.
But around 2:15, nearly 4 hours into the crisis, the progress Kavanaugh seemed to be making unraveled in an instant, when Reiser thought he saw a cop in a window across the street.
on the tape, you hear, well, things are getting calmer, maybe they're reeling this one in, and then all of a sudden, boom.
Then all of a sudden, bang.
Wait a minute, man. What? Try to bullet me, man. What? Hey, Dwight. What's going on out there?
I kill all y'all! Get in the damn window! I kill everybody in this mother. I'm tired of y'all. You want war? I'll give you a war.
And that's when Dwight Reiser made the threat that hit Kavanaugh where he lived.
I'm gonna kill one of your hostages and gonna be on your damn hand. Dwight, you got to settle down and talk to me. I don't learn to trust you. Yeah, you can trust me. No.
A standoff with an unstable man. The cops, it seemed, were powerless to protect the hostages from a self-declared suicidal kidnapper. And as Dwight's anger coursed through the phone lines, it was becoming clear that this standoff might be about to blow.
I'm gonna show you how nasty I can be. No, you don't need to show me how nasty you can be. Oh, yeah. Sick of people crying and going on all around me. Dwight.
I ain't crying my damn life. Nobody f***ing me. Nobody.
There's no doubt Dwight Reiser is armed, drunk, and quite possibly losing his grip on reality. He's already fired his weapon. He says he's got a Vietnam-era landmine in the room with him and his hostages. And the police had learned something else, something that just might change all their calculations. A record check on Dwight Reiser had turned up a long history of criminal convictions, including one for sexual assault at gunpoint.
He's hurt people in the past. He's fully capable of doing it again.
And at the time of this hostage crisis, Reiser was wanted in Texas on 2 more counts of aggravated sexual assault.
You're saying, could one of the women inside become a victim of sexual assault? And do we need to launch an assault right now to preclude that?
It's 4 hours into the crisis now, and the fugitive has already fired his gun twice. You're the commander. This could be it. What do you do? There are risks in every option. Just keep talking, or mount an armed assault and go in.
I knew that even though I wasn't trained to be a hostage negotiator at the time, I knew that as long as we could keep him talking, whether it was me or Reverend Singleton or who it was, that we had a chance of getting him talked out into coming out.
Hey, Dwight. Yeah. You want to talk to Reverend Singleton? Put him on the phone. Okay. Hello, Dwight? Yes.
The hostage-taker's behavior was becoming more and more erratic. He told the cops he was still drinking whiskey, and now he said he'd taken Orange Barrel Sunshine, a street name for the drug LSD.
I keep hearing people on next door. Won't they come to the front door there? It's what going to be that next door for? Yes. Come to the front door.
At 3:15, almost 5 hours into the crisis, Dwight Reiser upped the ante again, this time announcing he had placed bombs at a nearby shopping center and an airfield. Officer Kavanaugh dispatched men to those locations to check out the claims. Could he really be preparing to detonate bombs around town? It was clear that Reiser felt cornered.
I'm not going to rot in no jailhouse the rest of my life. I put in 10 hard years at TDC. 10 long, hard years.
The TDC, the Texas Department of Corrections, where Dwight had done time for robbery and sexual assault. It was a stark reminder of just how much danger Reiser posed to the women he was holding hostage. And to make things worse, Reiser's race-based paranoia had begun to flare up.
White girl keep on making bad eyes at me, I'm gonna blow them out. No, don't do that. Don't do that. Because, you know, she don't mean anything. If you keep on giving them eyes at me. No, she don't mean that. Don't. Just look the other way. Just don't pay that any mind.
But to themselves, the Reverend and the police were beginning to question Reiser's claim that he had 5 hostages.
If someone tells me I've got so many hostages, so many weapons, I'll write that down, but that's not a check that I'm taking to the bank.
Could Reiser be making up the 3 white hostages because he thought that would make the cops take him more seriously? To know for sure, Inspector Kavanaugh got back on the phone. He desperately needed some contact with the hostages.
Would you let me talk to one of them? Show a good faith?
Kavanaugh didn't expect him to buy it, but once again Reiser did the unexpected and handed the phone to one of the housekeepers held hostage. 5.5 hours into the crisis, it was the first direct communication between the cop and a hostage, and the brief talk reassured Officer Kavanaugh he'd been taking the right course.
We're just talking and tried to make her feel a little better, but you know, she's the one with the gun in her face.
Just minutes after that conversation, another shot from inside room 44.
Oh, damn it. What'd you do? Damn it. Gunfire. What'd you do, man? Oh, what'd you do? Don't worry about it. No, but I've got to worry about it. It's my job to worry about other people. Come to the door and see. Oh! You're long shooting at me, huh? What? Somebody shooting through the damn door, huh? What? Well, wartime, baby. Take care.
Out in the parking lot, about 20 men were armed and ready. As J.C. Hilton heard gunshots again, he looked to the sniper who was now positioned on a rooftop across the street, keeping his rifle trained on the window of room 44.
I just began to suspect it was going to come to a violent end, and I felt like it was probably going to be at the hands of our sniper.
But then the cops had another idea. They sent some men up to the motel roof.
One of the plans was that maybe we could force tear gas down into this vent that opened into the bathroom.
So the team prepared to use something they'd never worked with before, tear gas. They isolated a vent on the motel rooftop through which they could pump the gas directly into the vent in the bathroom of room 44. While the cops think about tactics, we want you to think about hostages. How many do you think there are? Remember, like Officer Kavanaugh, you've had direct contact with only one hostage, Addie. But Reiser says there are 5. What do you think?
And you always are dealing with if one of the hostages have a upper respiratory situation, if one might be pregnant.
In this case, the problem was hostage Addie Douglas's blood pressure. It was dangerously high, they learned from her employer. And tear gas could aggravate that, maybe even fatally. Too big a chance, the cops decided. The safety of the hostages was paramount. Officer Kavanaugh and Reverend Singleton kept on talking on the phone to Reiser, waiting for something to shake out. And then, as the afternoon slipped into evening, Kavanaugh says he began to detect a shift inside room 44.
Things were leveling off emotionally in the room.
Yes.
Something was going on.
Something was going on.
Something going on between Dwight Reiser and one of his hostages. To FBI hostage negotiator Clint Van Zandt, it was very good news, all part of a larger strategy.
I said, we have to get him to personalize, to identify with these people. If you identify with someone, it's harder to kill them. So start referring to the hostages that you know that are in there by their first names.
And that's just what Reverend Singleton did.
I'm talking to you as a brother because I love you.
Speaking gently to Reiser, he told him to let Addie and the others go.
Dwight, let the ladies go. And come on out. Let the ladies go one by one. And these, Dwight, where are you?
It was 6:10 p.m., almost 8 hours into the crisis, when the fugitive got back on the phone with Reverend Singleton and made his final demand. It's fair to say everyone in the command center was shocked.
Reverend Singleton turned to you and actually said,
he wants to marry one of the hostages. So I said, well, Dwight, I'm going to have to get back to you on this.
The fugitive said he'd end his siege if he could have this wedding to hostage Addie Douglas. Inspector Kavanaugh had no idea what to do, so he got back on the phone with Clint Van Zandt of the FBI. Van Zandt was astounded too, he says, but his first thought was it just might work.
Creeping in the back of my mind was that second thought of, okay, but if he does this, he may want to then die in the hands of the one that he's married to. He may do a homicide-suicide at that point. You can never dismiss the worst-case scenario.
Before you decide what you would do, here's another fact you may want to consider. The cop sent to check out Reiser's claims he had planted bombs around the city discovered he was lying. You're in command. Do you trust that the fugitive will be true to his word and let his hostages go if you meet this strange request? Do you give him his wedding or not?
Not something that we felt like was so unreasonable that we couldn't do it.
It was out there, but doable.
It was out there and it was doable. Let's do it.
Inspector Jay Kavanaugh assured the fugitive he would make all the arrangements. But he told Reiser he was going to need some legal advice for this one. Kavanaugh said he would have to contact a judge first.
I just wanted to buy a little time.
what were you thinking as you were buying this time here?
Well, I was hoping that it would work.
And Reverend Robert Singleton prepared to perform by telephone from a makeshift police command post to a kidnapper hideout, the unholiest matrimony he could have imagined. A shotgun wedding with the groom, not the father-in-law, holding the gun.
Okay, y'all holding hands now. If you take Dwight to be your lawful wedded husband, to love, cherish, and obey until death do you part.
The whole ceremony, if you can call it that, lasted less than 2 minutes.
I now pronounce you man and wife.
Inspector Kavanaugh did try his best to play the role of best man.
Dwight,
Yes, sir.
you're married, man.
I know.
Congratulations, please.
Thank you.
Reiser sounded pleased. But what now? Remember, this is a fugitive with a sexual assault conviction in a room with a hostage he thinks he's just married. And he's still got that loaded shotgun.
You're out on a limb.
I'm on a limb.
Reiser put Addie, his hostage bride, on the phone with police.
My wife want to tell you something.
Okay,
Don't y'all go back on your word. He's not going to hurt anymore.
we're not.
Okay.
It was 6:45 now, more than 8 hours since the crisis started. And Kavanaugh, back on the phone with Reiser, gave out instructions for ending it.
Okay, I want the hostages to come out and walk to their left, okay?
Then a long, long pause.
Dwight,
I'm finna send one out.
you can send one out?
Yeah.
Okay, we're ready.
Hostage Mary Grant, one of the motel maids, walked out of the room, and the Ruston police asked Reiser to send out the rest of his hostages. That's when Reiser finally came clean. There weren't 5 hostages in the room with him, just Mary and Addie.
I ain't have but 2.
Okay, where's Addie?
She with me.
Did you have a plan B during that moment after Mary came out and Dwight was alone
There
in the
wasn't
room?
time to have a plan B.
Yeah.
Kavanaugh was terrified that Reiser would rape his hostage or end the standoff in a murder-suicide, but he didn't let it show.
Is Addie fixing to come out? Can you send her now?
Why?
Well, that's our deal.
That's when the convict's suspicions kicked in again.
I just know y'all gonna mess me up, man. And I ain't got no way to defend myself,
Hey,
man.
look.
I know it, man.
But after another long pause, 3 minutes that felt more like 30, Dwight Reiser released his last hostage.
No hostage was harmed.
No.
I mean, that's got to be a big relief.
Yeah, it was. But in order to make this 100% successful, then he needed to give up.
I don't have nothing, man.
The person most tense about how all this would end was Reverend Singleton. He had developed a bond with Dwight Reiser during his bizarre negotiations, and he was worried it was going to be broken.
That's when I really started to feel bad about the whole thing. I cried.
Why did you cry?
They're going to shoot him. They're going to shoot him.
Come out with your hands up.
One of them gonna shoot, man. I don't mind getting shot, but I would have some in my hand to shoot back, man.
And then the Reverend made a promise, even though he himself didn't fully believe it.
Dwight, they're not like that. Come out with your hands up.
And then the door of room 44 opened one more time.
Mm-hmm. And he came out, got on his knees. I said, I'm glad this turned out the way it did. And then he looked at me and he says, well, am I really married? And I said, no, Dwight. I said, I'm not going to lie to you about that. I said, you're really not. I said, but I appreciate the way this thing turned out.
Dwight Reiser was extradited to Texas, where he's still in prison, serving a 75-year sentence for that previous sexual assault charge. Addie Douglas and Mary Grant went back to their jobs as housekeepers at the Economy Inn soon after the incident. When Addie sat down with Dateline, she told us she remembers just about every moment of that long Sunday back in 1987.
I prayed that day more than I ever prayed.
What's going on out there?
I kill all y'all! Get in the window!
The sharpest memory is when Reiser fired that first shot right over the head of her fellow hostage, Mary.
I was begging, please don't shoot, please don't hurt her, please don't hurt her. Crying, I said, she got little babies at home and I got babies at home.
Addie says she tried to keep Reiser talking about her kids and church and God.
Okay, where's Addie?
She with me.
Eventually, she says, he seemed to warm to her.
He looked me in my eyes and he said, you have the most beautiful eyes.
I would imagine that make you feel a little creepy.
It was creepy.
Okay, y'all holding hands now.
As for the decision to go through the bizarre wedding to her drunken, gun-toting kidnapper, Addie says it was a no-brainer.
I said, if this is the way for us to get out of here alive, why not? And so I said, yeah.
I mean, it really must have made your stomach turn to vow your love to
something you don't know,
guy.
A crazy person, a maniac.
Reverend Singleton went back to Lane Chapel Baptist Church, where he is now the head minister, teaching, preaching, and performing about 10 real weddings a year. He recalls his single brush with a hostage crisis all those years ago with the kind of modesty you might expect from a man of God.
I considered anything unusual, just another day.
Just another day in the life of Reverend Singleton,
Yeah.
SWAT team minister.
I guess you could call it that.
Clint Van Zandt retired from the FBI and went into private practice as a security consultant. He's also a consultant for NBC News. He's worked on hundreds of hostage situations, but that day in Ruston, he says, remains a highlight in his career.
We had got everybody out of there alive, and that's what you're there for, to save lives. And I don't think that anyone could have done a better job in the world than what that small town police